foam testing where they show half an arrow of penetration repeatedly over and over again, and that's a penetration test? Doesn't jive with real bow hunting.
Is the Ranch Fairy right about everything archery? This past July, we had the Ranch Fairy on the Hunter's Advantage podcast, and he convinced me to change my entire broadhead and arrow setup. After a full deer season of testing and 4 Pope and Young bucks down with my bow shooting a Ranch Fairy setup, the no BS, no bias results are in. But the question remains, was the Ranch Fairy right about everything archery? Let's get into it. In case you haven't heard of Troy Fowler, also known as the Ranch Fairy, he's one of bow hunting's most controversial figures in recent years because of his preaching of heavy arrows and single-bevel broadheads. If you don't shoot heavy arrows and single-bevel broadheads, you probably suck at bow hunting. I'm just kidding, but I know that fired some of you guys up. Like I said earlier, back in July, we had Troy Fowler, aka the Ranch Fairy, on the Hunter's Advantage podcast.
When I watch videos, I just go to the shot. I don't give a crap. I just want to see the shot. You're nice, seem like nice people. Oh, wow, you freaking got half an arrow.
We had over a 2-hour conversation with him about lethality, penetration, arrows, single bevel versus expandables, and bow poundages and kinetic energy. We beat the horse dead when it comes to talking about bow hunting and archery. So this summer I switched from a Exodus MMT arrow to an Exodus NIS micro diameter arrow and swapped my previous NAP Thunderhead 100 grain for a VPA single bevel 150 grain broadhead. This setup had somewhere around 15% FOC, which is well within the range of something the Ranch Fairy would recommend. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through the 6 different deer that I shot this season with this 585 grain setup. I'm going to talk about the shot distance, the placement, the blood trail, the penetration, and then at the end, we'll sum up all the results on what I thought about my Ranch Fairy setup for the 2023 season. So it didn't take long in the season for me to get to test out my Ranch Fairy setup. I had a wedding on September 30th this last season, and I ended up driving all night to make the October 1 opener in Oklahoma. It didn't take very long for a nice, mature 5.5-year-old 11-pointer to walk in front of me at 17 yards into me to put an arrow right through him. So this buck comes into about 17 yards, and I am about 22 foot up in the tree, shooting at a pretty steep downward angle. I draw back, I shoot the buck, and immediately something is different than the previous year's setup. When I shot and I reviewed the footage, I saw that the arrow cut through so easily and continued going through the animal. I had hand sharpened my VPA 150 grain single bevel broadheads, and it showed on this buck with a pass through both sides of the rib cage, double lung, and my arrow skipped. And my buddy Drew, who is on the hunting lease with me, he found my arrow about 20 yards past where I actually shot the buck. I didn't even recover it that day. The buck ends up running 25 yards away and piling up. So I went on the ground. Obviously, I talked about before I looked for my arrow. I didn't find it. And also, I didn't find a single drop of blood. There wasn't any visible blood, like, you know, when you know the direction that a deer ran off and you know he's dead, so you don't really examine the blood trail too much. But I could see the buck's antlers sitting about 25, 30 yards away. So I went up, picked up that buck, and celebrated a big mature buck down on opening day. So it checked the box for the penetration and pass through, passed with flying colors. The run distance of this buck was 25 to 30 yards, so very, very quick expiration with a nice sharp broadhead and a heavy arrow. The blood trail on this deer was subpar. I'm sure there was some visible blood if I would have took more time to look for it. When the buck is already on the ground, the arrow in the broadhead has done its job. The blood trail is kind of a nice to have at that point. All right, so let's talk about kill number 2. So this kill is a little bit different. It happened with a recurve bow. I drew out for an awesome recurve only hunt in Oklahoma, and this was my first time hunting with a recurve, and I had only previously shot at one doe with my recurve before this experience. So I go into this hunt, I'm about 15 foot up in the tree, and you can't film, sadly, on this hunt, but I had a really nice 126, 127 inch 8-pointer run right underneath me. He stops about 17 yards away, and I have a hole in the cedar, probably 12 inches by 12 inches to shoot through. I draw all the way back with my recurve, shoot, and I didn't know exactly where I hit the buck. So I get down immediately. I walk up to my arrow, and it's sitting at a 45-degree angle, stuck in the ground, and it is covered in blood. I wasn't expecting a really great pass through on my recurve because it's not generating a lot of energy. My arrows are a little bit different from my recurve. I think they're right around 500 grains with a 150 grain head up front. So I was wondering where it hit. I ended up hitting the buck in the lower part of his neck, severing the jugular. It was an easy blood trail. He ran about 150 yards and piled up. Shooting a deer in the neck is never an ideal shot and not something I want to put a lot of judgment on the arrow with, but the broadhead severed the jugular. The deer ran 150 yards and piled up pretty much immediately. And anytime you hit a deer in the femoral artery or the jugular, your blood trail is going to be insane, even with shooting a single bevel broadhead. So that was an awesome blood trail. Great penetration, but there wasn't a lot of stuff to go through with that little bit of neck meat right there. My perspective, that setup got an A+ rating despite my poor shot. So moving into kill number 3 is the biggest buck that I've ever shot in my life. This is a 150-inch, probably 5.5-year-old buck in southern Oklahoma, and I shot him at 15 yards on the ground with my compound bow. So I'm shooting the same 585 grain setup. It's a real dim morning on October 30th. This big buck walks right into 15 yards. I shoot him on the ground in the Vital V, probably 6 inches up that front leg. The deer runs 6-7 yards and falls over immediately. My arrow penetrated all the way through, hit one of the legs of the feeder, and sparked in the video. You can see it. It was pretty awesome. This was a really mature animal and weighed 215 pounds live weight and was 5.5 years old. There was a really thick hide and both shoulders and the rib cage and all that stuff to penetrate through. And my 585 grain setup worked perfectly. Penetrated all the way through the deer, hit him in the heart. He runs 6 or 7 yards and piles up. It just worked flawlessly in this situation. And one thing I noticed was I had the utmost confidence of just putting that arrow right where it needed to be, not worrying about the shoulder, because I knew I had enough arrow mass and the right head to penetrate through some sort of bone if it was impacted. That confidence allowed me to not be more risky, but it allowed me to shoot where I actually needed to be and not worry about the shoulder while I'm shooting a buck. So that buck made it 6 or 7 yards. The blood trail was non-existent because the deer took 2 or 3 steps before it fell over. And the penetration and the pass-through passed with flying colors. Let's talk about kill number 4, which was an awesome Texas buck that I shot right before Thanksgiving. In this hunt, I'm hunting with a decoy, and I'm thinking if a buck comes into this setup, it's going to have to circle downwind of the decoy and present me with a 20-ish yard shot. But as the buck walks in, you can tell he smells where 3 gooners were out setting up the decoy, 1 wearing gloves, 2 of us were not. So the buck tries to take a back step in this situation. He's sitting at 25 yards. I shoot him from about 15 foot up. A lot of times I hunt with 3 sticks in my platform, and we were doing a hanging hunt on this hunt. And so I shot this deer 15 foot up, 25 yards away, ended up with a complete pass through, buried the arrow into the dirt, and the buck probably makes it a little over 100 yards. So the blood trail on this buck was very impressive. When you talk about rolling out the red carpet, a person with no experience at all could have followed this blood trail. It was incredible, spraying out both sides of the buck. And before you ask the question, I did not hit the femoral artery. This was a double lung shot, and I watched the buck fall. So from the penetration department, a complete pass through, blood trail was incredible. And the buck made it just a little over 100 yards, just a textbook hunt. It was honestly the kind of performance that you'd come to expect out of a really big mechanical when you hit them in the right spot. Just the blood spraying everywhere and how nasty it is and the carnage. But this happened from a small cut single bevel broadhead. And it's honestly surprised me. Let's move on to kill number 5. So I shot 2 does right before Christmas in December with this same 585 grain setup. The first one was at 20 yards, complete pass through both shoulders. The deer ran just over 100 yards and piled up. So as this big group of 8 does are blowing at the doe that I just shot and ran and fell over, one of them trickles back by at a little over 40 yards. I drew back on her, hit her in the higher part of the shoulder, and dropped her immediately. I did have to put a follow-up arrow into that doe, but she made it 0 yards with that shot. And I'm confident that shot, even though it was in the high shoulder, it was going to be in the lungs. It's just one of those weirder situations where sometimes when you shoot a deer, they just drop. And that's exactly what happened with this doe. And to be completely honest, on the first doe, I know I got a complete pass through because my arrow was sticking 6 inches in the dirt. On the second doe, I'm not completely sure if I got a pass through or not. I don't remember. The blood trail on the doe that ran 100 yards was great, and the blood trail surrounding the doe that dropped was also good, but I didn't have to follow it very far. So I've spent a lot of time talking about my experience, which I think is the right thing to do for the bulk of this video. But I did want to talk about a few of the negatives that I saw while switching to a ranch fairy setup. If you're a person who doesn't shoot a super long draw length or heavy poundage, a heavy arrow setup and a single bevel broadhead that's over 100 grains is going to have some effect on your pin gaps, and it's going to have some effect on how far you can shoot. One thing I realized with my setup that was pretty heavy was the importance of an accurate range. I believe the reason that I hit the one doe high that was at 40 plus yards was when I ranged her, she was at 45. She took a few steps toward me and I shot her for the same distance, which ended up being high. When you're shooting a heavier arrow, the importance of having an accurate range is that much more important because your pin gaps are going to be larger. Your pin gaps and your ability to shoot longer distances is definitely a weakness of shooting a heavier arrow setup, but it's something to be mindful of before you make a switch. And if you were to look at the 12 factors of arrow penetration, which is the research that Dr. Ed Ashby put out after decades of studying this stuff, you would see that the weight of an arrow is number 6 on the list, with structural integrity, arrow flight, FOC, broadhead mechanical advantage, and shaft diameter to ferrule diameter ratio being 1 through 5. There's a plethora of things that affect arrow penetration that have nothing to do with shooting a single bevel broadhead or a heavy arrow. Obviously, the Ranch Fairy is a marketing genius by calling light arrows flappers and heavy arrows adult hunting arrows. I think a lot of people get too deep into the weeds on those things and just immediately comment back and don't give people the time of day. After using this setup for a full season, I can tell you that it works. Heavy arrows, single bevel broadheads, and science work. I would urge everybody that's watching the video to keep an open mind and look at the data being published about arrow penetration. Does this mean you should change your setup and shoot an 800 grain Ranch Fairy piss missile immediately? No. Does this mean just because you watched John Dudley's School of Knock that you should shoot at a mule deer at 112 yards with your 425 grain arrow setup just because it's on your sight tape? No. It means that you should examine all 12 factors that affect arrow penetration and apply some of them to your setup. I like to think of proper equipment and practice as the yin and the yang that come together and create a truly lethal archer and setup. I think the Bible has something to say about this situation too. In Luke 11:17, it says, Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, any kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and a house divided against itself will fall. Please take a second to remember that the hunting community in the grand scheme of things is very small. Make sure to subscribe and we'll catch you guys in the next one.